Good morning, everyone. Um, I hope that you had a safe weekend and now that you have a pretty relaxed election day as much as it can be. If you had the time to go vote so far, that's good for you. If not, then you're going to do it later also. That's great. I have diverted a little from your backgrounds that you sent me and chose one for us today. And this is actually a picture from George Washington's first inauguration, which took place on April 30th, 1789. It was actually in New York City, and it took place about 2 months after he took office. So maybe that was the standard for the difference between what's happening today. And just wanted to have something different for today. And now let's go talk about our issues. Today, we will begin talking about the new issues, the territorial disputes. Beforehand, two issues I want to mention. Both of them relate to the final paper. So as I said on the lecture on Thursday, later to this week, I will submit to you another short video. It's going to be somewhere probably Thursday or Friday, I'm not sure yet. It's going to be about 10-15 minutes long and going to provide you with some context and some details and some suggestions and things to think about when you are preparing your final project, which involves the final paper and presentation, reminding you again. So be on the lookout for that later this week. The other point is I remind you that I need to know by the end of this week what are you going to write about for your final project and who you're going to work with. If you're going to work by yourself, that's okay. If you're going to work with others, also let me know who are members of the team and what are you going to talk about. I already gotten some emails throughout last weekend and this week, and I'll just give you one thing to think about. It's okay to say I'm going to write a paper about democratic peace or audience cost. That's okay. But when you start actually thinking about what you're going to do for the project, you have to think of more specific questions, because if you want to write a paper about audience cost, you're going to have to write 4 or 5 books, because that's going to be enough to cover that topic. So just make sure that you think about that. And of course, I'm here for whatever help you need. There's office hours, there's my email, of course, when you're beginning to work on this project. So just make sure you are on top in that case, on top of everything, I'm sorry. Okay, so before we begin, let's do a quick review on Thursday. So I completed a discussion about the deterrence and the coercion theory by talking about mostly the strategies of coercion, deterrence, and the use of military power. I've talked a lot about the different conditions and how we define success or failure, and how do we distinguish between those two strategies. So deterrence can be viewed as more passive, while coercion is more active. Deterrence means we do not have to apply force in order to accomplish or succeed in our strategy. And coercion means we are able to accomplish or get the concessions that we want after already beginning the application of force. So that's one of the main ways we can distinguish among those two topics. And then I have talked about a couple of researchers that studied the efficacy of using military power, mostly aerial power, in applying those strategies and how successful they are. So the main paper we talked about was the Horowitz and Ryder paper, and they talked about different factors that make the applications of aerial power more successful. So those were the different strategies, whether it was denial, which focuses on military targets, versus punishment, focuses on civilian targets, the types of demands that the coercing actor is issuing matters a lot, and the regime type of the target. Democracies are more or less likely to be susceptible to accept those kinds of demands, and we talked about their findings. Then the Allen paper, which studied another aspect of this, mostly the duration of aerial campaigns or coercive aerial campaigns, showing that democracies are more likely to engage in shorter campaigns because of different factors. And her data actually supported those arguments. And finally, the idea of using aerial power to engage in coercive strategies versus non-state actors using the two different contexts. So one study talked about fighting in Vietnam. The other one was the Russian policy in the North Caucasus. And the bottom line for both of those papers actually suggested that this counterinsurgency strategy of aerial power, especially the ones that focused on punishing civilians, is not effective and does not generate the expected outcomes. It's not successful in that case. So that was one of the bottom lines, and we compared that to aerial strategies which focus on attacking military targets or attacking using a more discriminate applications of force is a much more effective way to counter those kinds of threats. So that was the argument. Of course, if you have more questions about that, you're more than welcome to email me, and we can talk about it more. Okay, so this week we have a whole new topic, and that's the topic of territorial disputes, territory and war. And we will begin with the role of proximity, or the distance between different countries, how that leads to those kinds of events, mostly clashes and wars. And the first paper you had, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, was the Vasquez paper, and that sets the foundations for this linkages between territory, proximity, distance, and war. And they begin by, and this paper begins by also mentioning the point that many of the wars in the past tend to happen between neighboring states. So for example, we have here a map of Europe during the 19th century, the earlier stages of the 19th century. And a lot of the wars that took place at the time during that century involved neighboring states. So Germany along with France, and France, which is not directly a neighbor of Russia, but France and Russia also had wars as part of the Napoleonic Wars in the beginning of the 19th century. So the idea is that neighboring states have a lot more wars than non-neighboring states. That's like basically just to think about that. And now I'll move to talk about what Vasquez has mentioned. He begins by providing kind of a realist type of logic to that phenomena, that why do wars happen more between neighbors? Because states clash. They're more likely to clash when they're seeking for power. Okay, so that's a very basic realist logic. And if we spin this to a more advanced version using the idea of neighbors, is that when states which were in close proximity to one another try to expand their own power, they will fight more. Now, another reason why neighbors are more likely to fight than countries who are not neighbors is because not a lot of states has the capabilities to fight long-distance war. I've mentioned the wars between France and Russia back in the 19th century. So those kinds of wars for France, who was not in close proximity to Russia, required a lot of resources and supply lines, which makes it very hard to fight long-distance wars. And that means that long-distance wars, ones not between neighbors, require states to have both the capabilities to fight that, as well as the opportunity, which in most cases is the proximity. So wars are more likely to be fought between neighbors. That's the basic argument in this case. Vasquez has mentioned in his early in the paper some of the work that came before him and provided strong relationship between territorial contiguity and the emergence of wars or militarized disputes. And he mentions the famous 1992 study that addresses dyadic data and interstate wars, in showing that indeed geographic or proximity and contiguity is one of the most powerful predictors of wars among different, a much larger list of factors. So that's just setting the baseline of the relationship between proximity and geographic contiguity and wars. Now, what he does in most of the paper is taking all those different explanations and breaking them down, trying to find which one makes the more sense. So he begins with thinking about proximity. The basic logic of this argument is that close proximity between states provide them with both the opportunity as well as the willingness to go for war. He also mentions the loss of strength gradient explanations, according to which when states are further distant from each other, it's harder for them to project power. So war in that case is less likely. Again, it's a kind of a spin for the realist argument. So that means that proximity, states who are in close proximity are more likely to go into disputes and actually go to war. But we need to remember that proximity in the thinking about it in the essence of a distance is constant. The distance between two states, between the United States and Canada, does not change. So we cannot think about contiguity or proximity as a cause for war, especially not as a cause for war by itself. We can think about it as the opportunity for conflict. If we add to that the military innovation and the technological advancement of the last 50, 60 years, that reduces the limitations of a distance as problematic for wars, because the United States can go into war today in East Asia with not much problem, even though it's very far away. So in that case, if we think about proximity as a cause for war, as an indicator for war, proximity is actually an indicator for a military strength. And when it's very close proximity, then states can unleash all their power and makes more war probable. That's how proximity actually explains war. It's not by the close distance right away, because again, the distance is the same. It's looking at proximity as an indicator for using your military strength in all its might. And that's, again, thinking about it from that standpoint. But still, this is one of the problems from thinking about proximity as an explanation. Another possible explanation he offers is interaction. So wars are a result of conflicts between interests of two countries. The more countries interact with one another, those interactions reveal more disagreements, and that provides more opportunities to use force to address those problems. That's the baseline of this argument. But the problem is that this explanation that relies on interaction cannot explain to us why more interactions may also lead to actually more cooperation. I've talked about it when I talked about the political economy lectures, when I talked about reciprocation overall as a theoretical concept. The more countries interact with one another, as long as their interaction persists over time, it's actually more likely to lead them to engage in a more cooperative behavior and not conflict. So how does it make sense that more interaction is going to lead to war? Also, from a liberal standpoint, the more the more interactions should lead to more cooperation, and more cooperations, if tensions exist, then cooperation should be lower in that case. So if we use that idea to explain the interaction part, we should actually say that a contiguous dyads of countries which are close to, which are proximate to one another, are more likely to engage in wars, which in turn reduce the extent of interactions between them. So that's the problem with this argument. What he suggests as the most logical in this case is what he called territoriality. According to this explanations, wars are a decision to engage in violence because they were unable to solve specific disputes by any other means. So that's, again, based on the argument that Fear makes. When two countries are unable to resolve their differences, bargain and find a solution, accepted settlement on both sides, they are likely to go to war. They may go to war. And he invokes the idea that the main dispute that leads to the war is territorial issues. The threat of territory provides us the willingness to fight, and proximity is still there, but again, proximity still only offered the opportunity to go to war. It's not the main part of the explanation. Now, by using this territoriality argument, what he actually suggests is that there are some types of disputes which are more likely to end in war than others. And the main one in this case is territory. When disputes are revolving around territorial issues, the probability of war is much higher compared to disputes which are based on disagreements when it comes to economics or other political concerns. So according to that argument, territorial issues are more likely to lead to war. But why is that? And that's an important part. One explanation in this case is that territory represents space, resources, food, all the things that are vital, they're essential for the survival of human beings. So if we think about it from research in biology or evolution, it makes sense that humans have learned or adopted the idea of using violence when they face disputes over territory. So in that case, the use of violence is some sort of instinctive reaction to situations where territory is in dispute. Still, according to Vasquez, territory by itself cannot be a cause for war. Even territoriality in that by itself cannot be a cause for war. It is the issue of territory along with the fact that states interact and try and have some kind of dispute about those issues. So if they have a problem that one state tries to expand its territory to the area of the other ones, that's, again, this is an interaction between two states revolving around territorial disputes, and that increases the likelihood that war will emerge if they have to manage their borders. Similar logic. He uses empirical data on wars from way back in the 17th century all the way through 1989 and shows how territorial disputes or territorial issues were at the heart of the vast majority of wars in each of those time periods. You see, he breaks down the history into different time periods, and he shows that when the issue was territorial issues, they were central for the frequency of wars. And the implications of this discussion so far is actually the core of the territoriality explanation. In that case, territorial issues are different from other political issues. They are more likely to lead two actors into a violent conflict than other types of political issues. And why does it matter? If we think about it from a policy standpoint, if from policymakers' standpoint they accept these explanations, they recognize that territory is the single most contentious issue among states, especially neighboring states, which are more likely to go to war by design. Then when we design our policy, we should focus on managing and resolving those kinds of disputes. So that's the foundation for the idea behind the links between territorial issues and the probabilities and the likelihood of going into wars. Now, I want to move the discussion to another, to a related element, which is based on this work by Vasquez, is viewing issues as a substantial part to explain motivation for behavior in foreign policy overall, and especially in the context of conflict. So in this case, we can think about the tensions between countries or the likelihood of conflict based on the issue of territory. And here we have a couple of examples for where territory is a very central issue. So here we have the 38th parallel, the border between the North and South Korea, which has a lot of historical examples for disputes. We have the famous wall at the south border of the United States with Mexico in different areas. And what you have here on the right side is part of the border. It's not a wall, it's a fence that separates between the southern border of Israel with the Gaza Strip. So in all of those areas, we have the issue of territory, which in this case is shown by using the border, as a central issue that leads to conflicts. So the study by Hensel and his associates promote an issue-based approach to foreign policy. So that's thinking about different issues in this context of foreign policies. Some of them include territorial disagreements, but other types of issues, and trying to assess how and whether those kinds of issues may lead to the adoption of different policy tools. Those can be the use of force, other policy tools can be diplomatic solutions, and others. But that's the idea behind promoting this view of an issue-based approach. So we begin with some definitions. Issue in this case is viewed as a disputed point or question. subject of controversy. And an issue-based approach views policymakers as concerned with achieving their political objectives over those issues. So it's not just a simple pursuit of power or security, which are, you know, relatively an abstract concept, but the more specific issues that policymakers have political objectives that they want to accomplish. Now, in order to, overall, we have large variations between issues. So there are territorial disputes, of course, which is the focus of our discussion, but there can be removal of changing of leaders, termination of different policies. One of the most common classifications of issues overall in foreign policy distinguishes between tangible and intangible issues. So examples for tangible issues can be security, which is safety from any kind of external threats, wealth, which is the accumulation of resources or goods, and survival, which is one of the basic human needs. But also, we can think about some issues which involve intangible values, and that can be issues related to culture, the identity of a country, the influence or prestige, status, and all those kinds of things. So those are the different types of issues that we have when it comes to foreign policy. Now, in order to address those issues, leaders will select different policy tools from a very large pool of options. They engage in what's called in the literature substitution, which means that they can choose among different types of policy options. Those can include diplomacy-related tools such as negotiations, bilateral negotiations, mediated negotiations. Other types of policy tools includes the use of threats such as economic sanctions or military threats, and of course the actual use of force. So those are the different policy tools that policymakers have to address those different issues. Now, to complement this introduction into this issue-based approach, one of the most critical concepts when it comes to focusing on foreign policy based on an issue approach is issue salience. An issue is more salient when it's more important. It's more likely to attract more attention to it. It's more likely to lead policymakers to focus on a single policy solution to that issue. Also, the way that some of those issues have been dealt in the past may affect how salient they are today. So from a kind of a definition standpoint, salience can be the degree of importance that is attached to an issue by the relevant actors, or the extent to which people and leaders value an issue. That's the way we should think about salience. So the importance of those issues rely on the values that they represent to the different individuals. That can be in terms of physical survival, that can be wealth, security, independence. So those values are different. But we can think about that thinking on the value of those different issues, some issues are more important than others. So there's large variation in the salience of the different issues when it comes to foreign policy. Let's circle back to our own discussions about territories, because I haven't talked about that for too long. The argument is that territory is a salient issue. And why is that? Mostly because it consists of, as I've mentioned a few minutes ago, essential resources for the survival of individuals. And that led some of the early scholars to suggest that territorial issues are the most important issues out of all the possible issues that lead to conflict when it comes to foreign policy. But those kinds of arguments ignore the fact that a lot of cases, conflicts and wars and disputes overall emerge because countries promote issues such as reputation, status are also very, very important. So it's not necessarily the most correct way to think about that. The territories are the most salient, the most important issue. However, territories do have very high degree of issue salience, because we can think about it on those two elements of issues, the tangible values and the intangible values. And for territories, those values are very, very high for both those categories. From a tangible standpoint, A territorial claim often involves land that has economic or strategic value, which is tangible in that sense, right? Because it's related to wealth or physical security. But also, territories have very high intangible value and significance because they can be related to issues such as the national identity of state, values such as independence, the prestige of the country. So that means that territories are highly salient issues because they have high values both from a tangible as well as intangible standpoint. As an example for another issue, which is less salient in this case and less prominent, for example, is maritime issues, and maritime disputes are less prominent because they have less value from an intangible standpoint. Territory is a lot more valuable from that compared to maritime issues. Now, salience as a concept here is important because it shapes the response for competition over those issues. When there's competition on some issue, in this case, we're focusing mostly about territory, then how salient is that issue? It matters for how do countries respond to that. For high salient issues such as territory, states will commit more resources, they will accept much more substantial cost, and the prospect of a military or a violent action is much more likely when the issue at stake is more salient, such as territory. And this is one of the main hypotheses that the work by Hensel and his associates test, and we're going to talk about it in a second. And again, thinking about it as an example, and those pictures are ironic in a sense because the black and white ones are the relatively more recent ones. But what we have here, the two pictures in black and white, are pictures taken from the War of Independence of Israel. Israel declared its independence in May of 1948. And following that, the Arab countries have invaded and invaded the territories that parts of it were supposed to be Israel at the time. So that suggests, again, the issue at stake was territory, and that led to military action and substantial investment and cost for both sides of the war in that case, because the issue at stake was territory, which is high salient. The other two pictures we have here are actually the same person. And this is William Wallace, which fought for the independence of the Scottish from the British occupation. And again, so this is the original William Wallace, and this is the more contemporary one from, I think the movie was about 20-something years ago, but we're more familiar with the portrayal of this individual by Mel Gibson. But again, the issue when it came to the Scottish independence was the territory of Scotland and the presence of the British at the time in that area, and that led to more aggressive action, violent interactions between those two sides. So again, the more salient the issue is, especially when it comes to territory, which is, we understand that this is a very important issue, the likelihood of a military conflict is much higher, violent conflict. So getting back to the work by Hensel and his associates, they test a series of hypotheses comparing different issues, identifying different contentious issues and what are the types of conflict solutions or peaceful solutions that are addressed. And what do they find? They find that territorial issues overall are much more likely to produce militarized conflict, especially compared to the other types of territories, which are maritime territories, maritime issues or river issues. Those are the other types of issues that they also address. The last point that I have here, and this is the important one, this is where they integrate the idea of an issue salience into their argument, is that the probability of a militarized conflict increases substantially when the salience of an issue also increases. And that's true for all types of issues, not just for territories. So the baseline probability of war in their data is 0.01, which is 1 militarized disputes per 100 eligible years. That's based on their data. But what they show is that with the salience, the degree of salience for that issue increases from the minimum amount, which is 0 in their data, to the maximum amount, the probability of war over that issue rise by approximately 5 times. So the more salient the issue, the more likely it is that states are going to go to a violent conflict based on it. Okay, so far I've talked about the basic idea of territories as the links between territories and violent conflict, and then that led us to talk about an issue-based approach to war, when the main issue in this case was territory, talking about the saliency of the issue. Now, I want to talk about a little bit more work that has been done in that context, such as the second paper that you had for today, the Right and Deal paper, which assesses why the territorial disputes are more likely to escalate into wars. And we know the territorial issues are more war-prone. We know that the likelihood is higher. But what we want to try and think about now is, what are the factors that actually generate this higher probability of war? And they focus in this paper on another category of factors. In this case, this is domestic institutions. So thinking about domestic politics and territorial issues, when two countries repeatedly have disputes over a territory, that's going to shape the domestic political interactions. That's the political debates within a country. And those who take a more hardline approach to those disputes will accumulate more and more influence over the political process, and at the end of the day, increase the odds that the issue of territory, in this case, is going to lead to war. To explain that, what Right and Deal mostly rely on, let me move that, is the concept of outbidding. So those are internal debates within the countries which are in dispute over some territory, and different elements within those countries are trying to outbid one another by calling for a more tougher approach or tougher actions against the rival in order to address this dispute over territory. And territory, as we said, is a very high value issue. When this kind of process takes place, then it's not very likely that politicians, who first and foremost want to secure their political position, will accept a compromise. Because again, we have here different elements within the political process, each one of them trying to outbid another by proposing a more tough approach to address that territorial disputes. And in this kind of an environment, the leader is not likely to compromise over the territorial dispute. The example in this case is a study that has been done on internal debates in Northern Ireland regarding the conflict in that area, which involves a lot of it, of course, around territory. And they show that some of the members of the political process gained substantial public support because they presented a very hardline call before they actually entered office. And once those individuals, those political figures that presented a very tough approach when it comes to the territorial issues in Northern Ireland, once those individuals entered office, they were reluctant to back down from these views, from these more radical views, more, I don't want to call it radical, but the tougher views when it comes to the issues of territory in Northern Ireland. And the chances of a compromise when it came down to this conflict were actually much lower. So how do we connect this point of outbidding and regime type? So first, democracies. Outbidding should be more powerful in democracies, and we can use selectorate theory to explain that. Reminding you again the basics of selectorate theory: leaders want to remain in office. To do that, they have to ensure that they have some portion of the public to support them, so they will be able to stay in office. When it comes to democracies, that what's called the winning coalition is much larger, because democratic leaders need much larger part of the population to vote for them in order to secure their position in office. So that's reminding you again the basics of selectorate theory, especially when it comes to democracies. I'm going to talk about non-democracies in a second. Now, coming back to our discussion about territory, what we can argue is that leaders will frame territory as a public good, right? In democracies, leaders are securing their winning coalition by providing a public good, because they cannot provide private goods because there's not enough resources to spread to provide it to the entire winning coalition, to all the public. So leaders are securing their coalition, in this case, in the winning coalition, when it comes to selectorate theory, by providing a public good, national security, public health, those kinds of things. So democratic leaders will try and frame territory as the public good that provide benefits to all citizens, especially the ones in the winning coalition, but all citizens generate benefits from this territory. And this is a very important, the value that they gain from that is, in this case, mostly intangible, right? We're focusing in this case on the public good. So the value that the territory has in this argument is mostly an intangible value. And the risk is for leaders who may consider compromise over their territories, because they will face that after mentioned outbidding behavior by their domestic political rival, and they may risk losing part of their coalition support facing the issue of territory. And that means that when a democracy faces a territorial dispute, in this case, first of all, democracies will bargain much harder and for much longer time, because those issues are so important for the leader to secure their position. Also, leaders of democracies will be more willing to escalate territorial disputes into war, because again, this is so essential for them. Those territories are so essential for them to secure their position when you think about it from a selectorate theory logic. So that's democracies. Autocracies are a little bit different. Reminding you again, basic all of the selectorate theory logic is that leaders of dictators and leaders of autocracies are more likely to provide private goods for their winning coalition, because the winning coalition in autocracies is much smaller. So it makes more sense, more efficient for those kinds of leaders to provide private goods to this smaller coalition to secure themselves in office, right? So leaders of autocratic countries will actually emphasize the tangible values of territory. So when there's going to be outbidding behavior during the territorial disputes, it's going to be mostly taking the shape of elite competition for elite interest, and not arguments such as this is the homeland, so that's the territory for everyone, or any kind of nationalist types of states. The focus is going to be on the tangible value of territory, because this value can be provided to the small willing coalition of the leader, and not to the intangible value that I described when it comes to democracies. One example, historical example in this case, is one of the motivations for the Japanese aggression before World War II was they were seeking control over some of the islands in the Pacific in order to support their economy. The Japanese at the time had a non-democracy, and the regime was not democratic at the time. So there was motivation here to emphasize the tangible aspect of this territory, of those territories, those islands, in order to secure the leaders at the time. And that was part of the motivation for aggression, and that led eventually to the war. Now, when you think about if a dyad of two autocrats in a territorial disputes, the likelihood of going to war is a lot lower, because both of those leaders will be reluctant to risk the loss of resources, which they will be able to provide to their small coalition. Instead, they will prefer this stalemate solution and looking for other types of goods that they can provide to their coalition. Another reason why the probability of war between two autocratic countries when it comes to territorial disputes is lower is that those two leaders do not face substantial political costs when it comes to backing down. They can go into a conflict, to a dispute over territory, and they can both back down, and the political costs are going to be small. All right, so one more thing we can do when it comes to autocracies is follow the work that we've already talked about a couple of weeks ago by Professor Wicks, and to unpack autocracies, right? Because there are different types of autocracies. So in this case, the personalist types of regimes, those who were led by one specific individual, such as the Saddam Hussein types, those are actually more likely to go to war over territories because the coalition in this case is very, very small. And the territory provides clear, private, tangible goods that can secure those leaders. On the other hand, other types of autocracies, the military junta types or the single party regimes, have relatively larger winning coalition, larger circle of support for the leaders. So the war in this case over a territory is a less efficient way to obtain resources which can be distributed then as a private goods. So that's another classification we can think about here. Personalist autocracies are more likely to go to war over territories while compared to others. So the authors used analyze data of dyads of regimes between 1860 and 2001. And those are some of the main findings. So overall, first of all, they show that the joint democracy dyad is less likely to go to war, which essentially is democratic peace theory. And a mixed dyad, which involves a democracy and a non-democracy, are more likely to go to war. Now, when we add to that the issue of territory, we see again that a mixed dyad and a territorial disputes is the most likely to go to war. What we have here is the different types of dyads. And we have here on the y-axis, you have the probability of war when the issue at stake is territory. So when it's a mixed democracy and non-democracy, the probability of war is much higher. And this is, again, the example of the democratic peace. Two democracies are the least likely to go to conflict. Now, reminding you again, what we talked about in the previous slide was further unpacking autocracies. So they do that as well. And what you have here is the different types of autocracies. This is a democratic regime and a strongman, what's called strongman, which is the personalist type of autocracies. And as you can see, this is the one which has the highest likelihood of going to war compared to other types. This is the military junta, for example. You see a very low likelihood of going to war when the territorial issue is at stake and they're facing a democracy. And those are kinds of some of the other types. So overall, what their main finding is that when we are talking about the mixed dyad of a democracy and a non-democracy facing a territorial dispute, the likelihood of war is much higher because the bargaining space between those two actors is much smaller. From the democratic country standpoint, reminding you again everything that I've mentioned earlier about how much how much effort democracies are investing in wars. So democracies will place more value on winning this kind of dispute. They will refuse to settle on a territory because this is a public good for them. It's symbolic, and it has a very high intangible value. Autocrats, on the other hand, view the more tangible aspect, the resources aspect of this territory. So they will also push to not compromise on that. So again, both of those kinds of motivations leads to higher likelihood that this kind of diet is going to go to war over territory. All right, the final part of the discussion today is I want to shift a little bit to a more of an individual level point of view and how, when we're thinking about it from a more individual standpoint, territory becomes an issue that is so important that that may lead to disputes. Now, oh, there it is. We're talking about political motivations to go into war, and to understand how some of those political motivations lead to war, I'll begin with a brief introduction of one of the central and controversial theories of IR, which is the diversionary war theory. I've mentioned that already in previous lectures, but let's just review that quickly. According to diversionary war, the theory posits that war is a result not of clashing interest or disagreement on different issues, but instead, this is the outcome of the behavior by leaders that face domestic political concerns. So they're trying to highlight or to generate a foreign policy crisis. And the motivation behind that is to divert public attention from the negative circumstances, for example, that are domestic in this case, such as economic adversity, social unrest, political crisis, all different types of domestic crises that represent a risk for the leaders. So they're initiating or highlighting a foreign policy conflict in order to divert public attention. Now, why would leader initiate this kind of crisis when it comes to foreign policy? They're trying to gain two types of benefits in this case. One is to shift the focus of the public from the incompetence or the failure of the government or the leader when it comes to the domestic issues. So the failure when it comes to the economy, the social related failures. By initiating a foreign policy crisis, you can shift the public attention from those failures into the threat of an external crisis. The other thing that they're trying to get is to generate public support because of the dynamics, which I've already mentioned several times in the previous lectures about what's called the rally around the flag effect. The main problems when it comes to this theory is that the empirical evidence is mixed. A lot of the early empirical evidence was based on economic crises and the behavior of the United States presidents, and that there was some support for that. And then more recent evidence was actually not supporting of the argument. A couple of examples, not from the United States context. So former Bolivian President Evo Morales was facing back in the early 2000s a growing protest at home in Bolivia. And he, in this case, he was able to spin those domestic problems by talking about invoking the loss of territory when it came to the coastline, following a crisis that Bolivia had with Chile way back in the 19th century. So again, the motivation for him was to shift the public attention from the domestic problem into the external threat, and he did that by invoking this crisis that happened with Chile way back in the 19th century. More recent types is a dispute that emerged between Croatia and Slovenia in Central Europe, and those were very closely close and very proximate in timing to the 2005 and 2008 elections that took place in Slovenia. So there was some form of a domestic pressure on the leaders in Slovenia, and maybe that has led to those kinds of intensifying disputes between the countries. That's also part of the example that we have here between Japan and South Korea. Their dispute over the Dokdo Island, which stands somewhere between Korea and the Sea of Japan. And when the Korean leader back in the mid-2000s has faced dropping approval and was facing upcoming elections, then he intensified that disputes over those areas. Again, generated or highlighted the foreign policy crisis to divert the public attention or to recruit public support facing an external threat. So that's the idea behind the diversionary war overall. Now, how is all that thing relevant to our discussion about territory? We're talking about the concept or the idea of a territorial diversion. Leaders can invoke a crisis based on territorial issues, and that is more likely to trigger the public responses that diversionary war theory stipulates. And why is that? Well, that's a good question. Territorial concerns are much more likely to promote or to trigger different types of mechanisms because of the high value the territories are for individuals. For example, territorial issues are more likely to generate the in-group, out-group mechanism and the higher threat perceptions of external threat, which in turn lead to more loyalty to the state and the leader. So, as an example, Canada is about to invade North Dakota. I hope my geography is not miscorrect here. So all of us facing this threat of Canadian invading North Dakota, we have to rally around together. There's high threat from the Canadian invasion to the territory, North Dakota, which is a territory belonging to us, the in-group in the United States. We have to rally behind the leader and oppose that threat. That's one reason why territorial disputes are such a powerful potential diversion mechanism. Territorial issues also elicit very strong emotional investment and mobilization of society and stronger bonds when it comes to society. And the example I want to talk about here is the 2005 disengagement of Israel from the Gaza Strip. So let's have a map in place so we can talk about it. So this is the Gaza Strip. It's in the southwest part of Israel. It's a very small area. It's about 25 miles long. That's all. About 5 miles wide between this. You see the eastern border of the strip with the Mediterranean Sea is about 5 to 7 miles wide. This map is from the early 2000s, so it says that the population in this case was about 1.4 million. Today, it's about 2 million Palestinians reside in that area, which makes it one of the top 3 or 4 most densely populated area in the world. Now, since the 1970s, Israel has initiated a policy of establishing settlements. Jewish and Israeli citizens settled in that area. So you can see here, for example, this is Gaza City, and there is a couple of settlements here. This is, for example, this is Dugit. That's one that was here right on the border. Netzarim is another one that was here. My mom, by the way, lives in a small village here outside of it, but irrelevant. And a lot of out of them here, all those, the names that you see here, a lot of them are different settlements that Israel had in that area. And after a long political process, a lot of discussions within different governments, in 2005, former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has decided that the Israeli settlements will be evacuated, the Israel citizens will be removed from that area, which one of the problems that we had here at the time was that the military forces had to be stationed in that area in order to protect those Israeli citizens. So in 2005, there was the disengagement from Gaza, which was the withdrawal from those areas outside of the Gaza area, and the control was given back to the Palestinians. Now, why do I talk about all that? Because the main point I want to talk about here is the strong emotional connections that people have with territory. And what you have here, some of those pictures that I added here on the right side, were very prevalent at the time. There was very strong and very emotional wave that went over Israel during the time of the disengagement, because those people, regardless of whether you agree with their political opinion, whether they should be in that area or should not be in that area, and that's not the point here, they had a very strong connection to those territories. This was their home for so many years, and essentially they were removed from their home. So there was a very strong connection that shows here of how much citizens have a strong connection to territory, which makes it such a salient and important issue. All right, so that's just as an example to show you why territory is such a powerful issue. And what that means is that leaders can find a lot of advantages from a political standpoint by making territories more likely to be part of this diversion policy. Now, if we want to use territory as this linchpin of the diversional logic, it provides us a lot of benefits. First of all, when the conflict over issues is more proximate, because it's territorial conflict, it's going to draw more of the public attention. It's going to more likely to generate those expected effects. The issue is salient, and the value is very, very high. So the likelihood of successful diversion in this case is much higher. I talked about the strong ties that people have when it comes to land. That's related to their identity and their culture, which are more intangible values. But again, all those provide better odds that territorial issues are going to be more successful when it comes to diversion. The fact that territorial issues are that important to people means that they will have more motivations. There's going to be great willingness to fight over land, which may not have as much as high economic and strategic value. And it actually is going to have, these territories may actually have economic and strategic costs. So for example, Israel paid a lot of economic and strategic, and of course also in human casualties, a lot of cost for having those settlements in the Gaza Strip for so many years. But a lot of people were willing to fight over it because it was that powerful. But that means that thinking about territory as a diversion, in the diversion context, the the pursuit of territory or the importance of that issue is not always the most rational, calculated type of process. And again, the example of Israel and the Gaza settlement is a good example here. The last point when it comes to using territory as a central aspect of a diversion behavior is that if we use territorial issues, it expands the applications of the diversion theory beyond the US case. The early work on diversion war theory focused mostly in the United States. And when we're using territorial issues, we're able to expand that beyond that, because if we're thinking about territory as a motivation for diversion, that is relevant to any type of leader in the world which faces domestic unpopularity. Talking a little bit more, as I said in the beginning, about the individual level perspective of this, we can think about that from a constructivist standpoint. So why do people become more attached to territories? Because they become socialized and emotionally attached to the territory. They're thinking about it as belonging to them. It becomes an integral part of their identity, and that's in a way ingrained in the national psyche. So that's a more social constructivist point of view. We can also think about it from a psychological point of view. Viewing the land as a part of a zero-sum game, it's indivisible, compromise is not an option, and the only way to counter any kind of problems when it comes to controlling the territory is by using brute force. So that's part of those more psychological explanation. We can think about other psychological mechanisms that we've mentioned earlier, for example, prospect theory. Using territory as the reference point in a prospect theory. If we may lose a territory as part of territorial disputes, that's going to put us in what's, using the framework of prospect theory, a domain of loss. So that's going to lead us to engage in a more risk-taking behavior, and we are accepting the prospect of war to recapture this land. And that's from a strictly psychological standpoint. We can think about it. The example I have here is the Vietnam War. The number of soldiers that were lost because some territory was lost in some kind of battle with the Vietnamese, and then another battle took place in order to recapture that land. Because we had to capture that, we were accepting the risk of taking this, of engaging this kind of policy, and the number and the cost that were paid were very, very high. So this is some of the basic mechanisms that tell us how important is territory in this case. Before I go into really the final part of the discussion today, I'll stop for today's attendance word. So today's attendance word is Arkansas. Arkansas as the team that the Aggies played over the weekend. So all those different dynamics talked about, whether it is psychological, whether it is emotional, whether it is constructivist standpoint, all that suggests that leaders can manipulate the public by invoking a territorial issue into a diversion conflict. So using the territorial issue in order to generate this diversion when it comes to conflict. And the end result, according to what the leaders are hoping to gain, is that the mechanism of their territorial dispute, a territorial conflict, is going to generate much stronger public support, and the public is going to rally behind the leader, even though there are certain domestic problems. Now, this is what the leader hopes to get, but one thing we also have to think about is the potential cost for diversionary war. So for one thing, conflicts have very clear costs, and a prolonged war may generate costs that's going to be too high, or is those costs are going to outweigh the potential benefits from actually engaging in a diversion behavior. The rally effect, which is so important for that type of behavior, is, first of all, it's not certain, it's not automatic, it's not always a rally when the leader invokes that. And also, even when a rally effect does exist, in many cases it's short-lived. And the final thing is that leaders may be blamed for opening this unnecessary war, reminding you this belligerent cost that I talked about when we talked about audience cost, that when the war is going to end, the leader is going to be blamed for opening that war, and all the benefits that the leader was able to accumulate by invoking this diversionary war are going to be lost because of the way that that leader is going to be viewed when the war actually ends. So the author uses data on militarized disputes and territories in order to test this argument that territorial diversion, using diversionary factors or diversionary incentives when it comes to territorial disputes, it's going to make war more likely. And what he shows is that leaders who face low popularity, and he uses the indicators of different indicators regarding social unrest. So there's a lot of social unrest in the country. The leaders are not popular. And that increases the likelihood of a diversionary territorial conflict. Other types of diversionary factors in this case, so for example, economic problems, he finds that they are less powerful because the evidence in this case is weaker. Finally, he wants to compare and show how those diversion factors, such as economic problems or social problems, how are they in comparison to other types of factors and how they may lead to war over territory. So he generates those marginal effects of those different factors. And what he finds is the effect of those diversionary factors, such as social problems, economic problems. It is a positive effect on the probability of territorial war, but is limited. So the worst case scenario when it comes to diversionary factors, or the most severe diversionary incentives, is when leaders are facing very bad economy, they face social unrest, and there's elections that are coming. When those conditions exist, then the probability of a territorial war are increased by about 40%, which is very, very high. But this is the worst case scenario. When we're looking about the more average types of scenarios, then the strategic type of indicators, such as the distance or the power of the states, are much stronger predictions when it comes to territorial disputes compared to the diversionary type. So the diversionary incentives matter a lot for the probabilities of conflict, but not just the diversion incentives in this case. All right, so that's what I have for today. If you want to read a little bit more, so as usual, we have very recent studies that address those kinds of territorial disputes, and you're welcome, more than welcome to read them. Reminding you again, we are going to have the Thursday lecture and an additional one. You're going to get at some point on Thursday or Friday. With that, I am done for today, and I will see you later this week. Goodbye, everyone.